Hello, ladies and gentlemen, it's the Historical Gamer once again, and today I'm going to be returning to Commander the Great War. This is part 28, I think it is, of my Let's Play series. We're into October of 1917. We have beaten the Russian in the Eastern Front a little bit early. The Middle Eastern Front is starting to fall apart, and we are trying to shift our troops from the Eastern Front, which has just been pacified, to the Middle East as well as the Western Front. One thing that we do have the advantage of that the Germans didn't historically is we don't seem to have to hold any reserves on the Eastern Front. So we have been able to stabilize a very dangerous Western Front, and we actually knocked the Italians out of the war last video as well. So with the victory on the Italian front, we knocked them out in a way that we gave them a peace treaty. We didn't overrun them completely, but we did take the majority of Italy. However, we don't have a southern front in France to deal with, but to be honest, at this stage, with our manpower shortage as is, the smaller the front line, the better. With that being said, as we're working through this, the last video we talked about Operation Michel. In the first 3 days, March 21st, 22nd, 23rd, which represented the Battle of St. Quentin, when the Germans used some of their new stormtrooper tactics and began to overrun the Allies in the spring of 1918. The first 3 days was, again, the Battle of St. Quentin. The British fought valiantly. The Germans were attempting to split the British and French lines. They attacked along the line where both armies met, and they were trying to drive a wedge between the two so they could drive the British up against the Channel coast in Belgium and destroy them, and then turn their efforts against the French, who would then be all alone. The offensive was calculated to take place before the Americans were able to bring the majority of their forces to bear, before large American manpower could turn the tide against the Germans, and it started as well when the Germans had a limited time numerical superiority on the Western Front. Not only did they have a numerical superiority, but because they had the advantage of being on the offensive, they could come and bring more troops to bear than even their numerical advantage allowed, because they could bring their forces concentrate against one objective, while the Allies had to man a defensive line that was strung out and couldn't concentrate until they found out where the Germans were coming. As we discussed, the Battle of St. Quentin was the first part of the offensive, which took place for the first 3 days, and despite sort of this perception of the Germans overrunning the British and advancing 40 miles rapidly with ease, that isn't quite how things played out. The Germans' massive bombardment was incredibly successful by comparison with previous offensives, and in the first day the Germans did gain several miles of ground, which was unprecedented. However, the British did not break and run, as many would believe, and their forward positions, while being pushed back steadily, were not completely destroyed. In fact, while the British were being pushed back, it wasn't until the 24th that it became very difficult for the front lines to be detected. Around March 24th, the Battle of St. Quentin had ended, and the British were pulling out. However, they continued to fight the Germans valiantly, with various rear guard actions that continued to inflict heavy casualties on the Germans, although the British were certainly losing more men than the Germans, and in fact the British were losing large numbers of prisoners, because as the Germans advanced, they overran British positions, often fighting to the last or surrendering after being surrounded. The lines were kind of melting away, but not quite as rapidly as you would think. Again, on the 24th, the front lines became difficult to distinguish. By the 25th, the Germans had advanced far enough into the British rear that they began capturing British supply dumps. And actually, while this seems like a monumental achievement, it was something that really hadn't been accomplished in any major offensive since 1914, it did come with some drawbacks. As we had mentioned earlier in our previous videos, the Germans were actually suffering from severe food shortages. The situation at home had begun to become unstable, as the population had started rioting against living conditions and the rations that the population was getting shrinking, and the army was also not in great shape either, with very poor nutrition, very limited supplies, and there seemed to be a perception amongst Germans that, while we're struggling, so are the Allies. The Western Allies might be a little bit better off, but really they're struggling. We've got this massive U-boat campaign that's going against them. Surely they're short of food as well. And while the German U-boat campaign throughout 1916 and 1917 was very successful and was sinking far more ships than could be built, it was not strangling the armies. The entry of America, the vast influx of shipping that the Americans would bring, and the convoy system would eventually defeat the U-boat campaign against the Allies. And again, the Allies, because of their massive industrial superiority, thanks in large part to the United States' entry, was much more well-fed. In fact, they were more well-fed throughout the entire war. Consider the fact that the German industry had to provide food, arms, ammunition for an army that beat the Russians by themselves, beat the Romanians largely by themselves. Again, the Austrians fought, but they were certainly the lesser of the two parties, was propping up the Ottoman Empire, and was now trying to help fight against the Greeks, as well as fighting on the Italian front. So the Germans were fighting almost all of Europe by themselves, so they had vast economic potential, but again, they weren't able to keep their armies supplied to the same extent that the Western Allies were. So on March 25th, as the Germans began overrunning Allied supply dumps, they were actually demoralized by these vast quantities of supplies and food that they were seizing, because there was this perception, thanks to propaganda, that the Allies were starving just as poorly as the Germans, thanks to the U-boat campaign, but that was simply not the case. It could have been if the U-boat campaign had ended up being as successful as it was in early 1917 throughout the entire year, but again, things had started to change with the introduction of the convoy system. As it was, the Germans were overrunning the Allied lines, but being demoralized as well by what they found. And as they continued to advance, the British continued to fight vicious rearguard actions, throwing divisions in to delay the German advance so that more defenses could be set up. By the end of the 25th, the fifth day of the offensive, the Germans had overrun the Somme line and had pushed back past where the Somme offensive had occurred in earlier years in the war. I think it was 1916. So the Germans were advancing rapidly, but already by the fifth day of the offensive, things were beginning to turn poor. We had mentioned that the Germans were taking heavy casualties, and their stormtrooper units, which were always leading the offensives, always leading the attacks, and allowing the Germans to infiltrate and overrun the Allied lines, were beginning to take grievous casualties. They were doing better than infantry units normally would, but again, attacking time after time over 5 straight days, exhaustion started to play in, and again, you might only take a couple casualties, but each attack, those casualties add up, and there are no elite replacements coming for the Germans. This is the bottom of the barrel. This is all they have, and this is their best troops mobilized into 40 elite crack divisions that are going over the top continuously, day after day, without any hope of relief. It's almost like the Japanese Zero pilots in the Solomon campaign in 1942 and early 43 during World War II, where the Japanese had far better pilots and very high-quality equipment, but eventually a war of attrition would occur, and the Japanese just didn't have the training mechanisms set up in place to replace their elite pilots. So they won dramatic victories, massive successes against the American pilots, but eventually they were worn down to the point where untrained rookies were being thrown in, and that was very much the same situation that was occurring in 1918. Although by the fifth day things looked great, the Germans were overrunning the Allied positions, they were advancing. The Allied lines again continued to hold out, but they were falling back in relatively good order. Again, tens of thousands of prisoners were being taken, but this was by no means a rout. To the public and to the generals, it may have felt like a disaster, it may have felt like 1914, but nowhere did the Germans truly destroy the Allies, nor did they truly completely overrun the Allies. They were pushing them back and inflicting heavy casualties, but that was about it. And actually, in this game, if we kind of take a moment to take a look here, you can see we are overrunning the Allies much more successfully than the Germans were in 1918. Here you can see us encircling large units in Liège, and again, there are massive gaps in the Allied lines. Perhaps there's reserves behind there, but as far as we can see, it seems like we have an open road to Paris. So that's a very positive development here. As we return to Operation Michael, things remain much the same for the next 5 days of the offensive. The Germans would continue to attack, the British would continue to be overrun, and they would continue to be forced back, but all the while continuing to fight vicious rearguard actions that would take their toll and inflict large casualties. One good thing for the Allies that came out of this offensive was in the crisis, in the feeling that they were being overrun and defeated. For the first time in the war, the Allies came together and they agreed on a joint command. They would have a supreme commander. The supreme commander would be General Foch, who was a French general throughout much of World War I, and would be largely regarded as a hero after the war. But it was the first time in the entire war that the Allies could come together and say, yes, we agree, we're going to have one supreme commander of all of our Allied forces, and that was really a turning point on the Western Front. As for the first time, it wasn't bickering French and British kind of trying to come together and form some sort of coherent strategy on the front. For the first time, there would be one commander, one head, who would lead all Allied forces. And this would end up leading to a much more successful offensive. After the German offensives failed, it would lead to the 100 Days Offensive, in which case the Allies would launch coordinated attacks between the French, British, Americans, Portuguese, and other countries against the Germans and eventually drive the Germans back and defeat them. But for now, the Germans were continuing to advance. They would continue to advance for a couple of more days, but around the 13th or the 14th day of the offensive, things began to sputter and basically come to a halt. The Germans were exhausted. They had advanced over 40 miles in some places in just the span of 2 weeks, whereas previous offensives that had lasted months would normally only advance a mile or two, or even sometimes just a couple hundred yards. In this case, the Germans had advanced for 40 miles. The Germans were not threatening Paris yet, as the main offensive took place a little bit further north. As we said, the attack occurred between the French and the British armies, and with the promotion of Foch, things became a little bit more organized. The Allies organized a defensive just east of Aisne in France, and again, I'm sorry, I'm probably butchering all of these pronunciations, where the Germans continued to attack until they were eventually stopped. The last day of the offensive was the 15th day of the offensive, and on that day the Germans attempt to renew the offensive, but the attacks failed. So, 15 days, March 21st until April 5th, the Germans attacked. They advanced over 40 miles. In those days, they inflicted more than 240,000 casualties on the enemy. Yet, despite those casualties, the Germans themselves lost over 230,000 casualties on their side. And remember, the Americans were pouring hundreds of thousands of reinforcements into the Western Front every month, whereas the Germans could hope for very few reserves. They had 1 million men that were tied up in the Eastern Front that perhaps eventually some of them could come, but that wasn't any time soon. Probably 1919 at the earliest, if even then. That assumes everything on the Eastern Front goes well and the occupations go well. So realistically, the Germans had no hope for casualties. They really didn't accomplish much. They pushed the Allies back 40 miles, but there were no strategic changes on the front. They had and even suffered some morale losses as a result of sort of realizing the Allies were in decent position, and they had expended tons and tons of elite crack troops. And again, remember, this is going to come back to haunt them, because they had taken all the best and brightest out of their other units and concentrated them in these elite divisions. And now these divisions are being chewed up in constant attacks that are gaining nothing in the way of strategic changes and gaining meaningless ground, as well as stretching the line out and increasing the defensive frontage that they had to man. So they were having to man more and more square miles while accomplishing no noticeable difference. Sure, the Allies may have suffered somewhat of a morale drop, but they had even pushed the Allies into agreeing for the first time in the entire war on a combined command. So really, in essence, Operation Michael fails in every single regard. They gain a whole bunch of meaningless ground, they unite the Allies under one commander, and they lose morale on their own side, as well as suffering hundreds of thousands of casualties which they cannot replace. The Allies suffer hundreds of thousands of casualties of their own, which they cannot immediately replace either, so for the time being they're weaker, but in the coming months, hundreds of thousands and eventually millions of American troops are going to pour into the Western Front and replace every single Allied casualty, while the Germans are going to gain nothing. So, in essence, Operation Michael failed in every regard. It was a tactical success to some extent, but otherwise, it was just a waste that accomplished nothing. And that was part of the problem with Ludendorff's plan. His idea was, let's attack everywhere we have success and attack nowhere where we have failure. Reinforce success and stop where you have failure. The problem with that is you can attack a whole bunch of areas the enemy doesn't really care a whole lot about, have a whole bunch of success, lose a whole bunch of casualties, but in the end you don't accomplish anything because the enemy doesn't put their serious effort behind defending those places because really they're not the places they care a whole lot about. And when the enemy does commit to a defensive, you're already worn out and you've done all this work and really not gained anything. So again, the idea of reinforcing success, it seems like a smart one. You don't want to attack where there's, a futile attack, and you want to continue, reinforcing success to press the enemy. But if those successes are coming in areas where there is no strategic benefit to be gained, well then, again, you waste your effort on something that's more or less meaningless. So there you have it. That's the end of the first main German drive against the Allies in March of 1918, March and early April. It took place again from March 21st until April 4th and lasted 15 days. The Germans would only pause 5 days before renewing the offensive. This time they would shift north in what was called the Lies Offensive. Some would refer to Operation Michael as the Somme Offensive. The Lies Offensive would be what's called the Second German Drive. It would take place from April 9th until April 29th in the north, in Flanders, in Belgium, and northern France. And in this offensive, the Germans would again use the same tactics and attempt to overrun the Allies. The idea was to push the British back, cut them in two, and drive them into the sea. This time they weren't trying to split the two Allied armies because they were much further north and they were just dealing with the British, but it was an attempt to deal the British a final blow and destroy the British army in France. And again, it gained some initial successes, not nearly as much as Operation Michael, but it did gain some initial successes and did overrun and push the front line back in dramatic fashion. The Lies Offensive's strategic goal was to move in and take Ypres, which had been a major battleground for the entire war, drive the British up against the Channel ports, and force the army to be withdrawn from the French theater and basically out of the war. In this it failed. Again, it achieved initial tactical success. It was a much smaller scale operation than Operation Michael. Operation Michael was just this massive fist of 72 German divisions that was put to bear. The Germans only put 26 divisions into Operation Lies, or Operation Georgette, as the Germans called it. It'd be interesting to see what kind of success they may have had if they had brought in the full 72 divisions, but the casualties the Germans had lost in Operation Michael prohibited such a significant effort being made in the north, and it's unlikely, again, even if the British had been driven back and forced against the sea, or maybe they had swung around and retreated into the interior of France, even if they had been pulled out of the Channel ports, they could just put on ships and moved in through Brest and kind of into the rear of the Allied lines. So it's unlikely it would have had that kind of success. But again, over 100,000 Allied casualties again, but again, over 100,000 German casualties. And now that the French and the British are both under one unified command, you see the French reinforcing the north of the line as well. So again, the Second German Drive did not obtain the objectives that it had sought, and while it gained initial tactical success, it ended up failing ultimately. So the stage was set. The Germans' strongest offensive, Operation Michael, sees massive gains but no strategic difference, and the Germans' second offensive, which was a little bit weaker, but still had the same sort of tactics and whatnot, failed as well. And this led to the Third German Drive, or the Battle of Aisne, which is named after the French river. And again, I'm sorry, I know I'm butchering the pronunciation, which would be the Third German Drive. Now, there were 7, or were they 5? 5 German drives against the Allies in the spring of 1918, but this is going to be the last gasp, the last huge push with stormtroopers that the Germans are going to try and break through. Their other drives, by that point the Germans were more exhausted, there were very few stormtroopers left, but the third drive, which would take place on May 27th until June 4th, would be the last time that your Germans are really going to have this cream of the crop, these elite stormtroopers, these elite divisions that are really able to slice through the Allied positions at will. This is their last attempt, their last try, basically, where they're still very strong, and while still becoming, more and more exhausted and tired, it was really their last hope. And the Germans took their time in preparing this offensive. There were only 5 days between the Operation Michael and the Lies offensive. But there was a full 28 days, 29 days between the end of the Lies offensive in the north and the beginning of the Aisne offensive in the south. And this offensive would be aimed toward Paris. It would close the gap to Paris and seriously threaten the city for the first time since 1914. It would take place along the Somme offensive's objectives, but just south of it. Again, pushing the Allies back. But we'll talk a little bit more about that offensive in our next video. For now, I appreciate you tuning in, and we'll just take a real quick look. You can see here the situation is turning dramatically in our favor here. We are now into December of 1917. You can see the Allies are overrun. They don't have troops along a large part of our front line, and we do potentially have the ability, depending on what they have back there in the rear, to maybe turn the Allies out of their lines. We've surrendered some troops in Liege. We've begun bombarding them. We've destroyed several Allied formations, but our offensive continues into the winter, into difficult conditions. We're continuing to attack. Meanwhile, we've sort of stabilized the line in the Middle East just south of Anatolia, where Turkey starts, and things are looking good. It looks like, I had been pretty pessimistic about my chances to actually win this game, but it does look like things are starting to turn around where maybe, just maybe, we have a chance of winning. Now, you can see the German national morale is pretty low at 58. The Turks are down at 44. The Austrians and the Bulgarians are still pretty enthusiastic about the war. But with the Germans' morale so low, I'd be worried that that may start to have an impact on the ability of our troops to fight. And in some ways, this war is kind of resembling the real war. We launched a last dramatic offensive after the Russians fell, and our national morale is very low, so this is kind of our last gasp, our last hope. We don't really have a whole lot in the way of income. We've gotten a little bit more the last few turns from some merchant ships, but for the most part, our income is pretty limited. Our ability to supply reinforcements is pretty limited, and we're just launching one last gasp to try and overwhelm the Allies. And I just wonder if the Americans hadn't come into World War I wouldn't say that they saved the war, because really it was the French and the British who did almost all the fighting, and even at the end, it was the French and British who did the majority of the winning. The Americans certainly paid their own price. They had over 200,000 casualties in World War I. Or was it over 150,000? I can't remember offhand. But they had well over, the second bloodiest modern war in American history, the third bloodiest war in American history, behind World War II and the Civil War. But the Americans certainly paid a price. That's not to diminish what they did, but when you compare it with the losses that the French and British suffered, and the fact that even in 1918, when these massive offensives are being launched, the majority of the troops taking place are still French and British troops. When you consider all of that, you do have to wonder, though, without that massive influx of American manpower that really freed up hundreds of thousands of other Allied troops to launch offensives, what would have happened? And maybe this is what would have happened. Maybe the Germans, when they broke through the lines, when they pushed the Allies back, would have prevented the Allies from being able to shift troops around and bring reinforcements in. Because while the Americans are not launching their own offensives in the spring of 1918, and while their actual participation in the German drives is somewhat limited, they were taking up places on the front line, allowing French and British troops, experienced troops, to shift against the Germans. But it doesn't look like that's going to happen here because, again, we're not at war with the Americans, thank goodness. So this offensive may have a better chance to succeed. You can see here we are getting in and around many of these troops. We're driving. You can see many of these units are exhausted. We're destroying them. We're overrunning them. So things look grand right now for the Central Powers. But that's going to cut this video off here. In my next video, I will talk about the last German drives against the Allies. And then we'll go and we'll talk about the late war and the end war. But it feels this series is coming to an end, so hopefully we have enough time to discuss the later war. And if we do, again, we'll continue as long as we can until this Let's Play is done. I've enjoyed it a lot, but for the first time in a long time, I am very optimistic about the way this thing is going. I'm most worried about the front along Turkey, because if Turkey collapses and if we lose all those troops in Turkey, the Allies may have an underbelly to pour troops in, and I don't feel like the British have committed too much in the way of land troops to this war yet. So, they may have some reserves. But anyway, guys, that's going to do it for my rambling about World War I and about Commander the Great War. I appreciate you tuning in, and I hope you guys continue to enjoy the series. I will continue doing it until this war is over, although things do have started looking good. Anyway, again, that's all the time I have for you today. Feel free to leave comments in the bottom or, ask me any questions. And until next time, this is the Historical Gamer saying thank you for watching, and I'm out.